Okay, today I'm going to talk about listener cues. I'll go over what they are, why people use them, and how you as the listener can recognize them and be a more engaged listener. First, we'll talk about how you just know to respond to what the speaker is saying or doing. So how do you know when you're getting a listener cue from a speaker? One of the most obvious ones that I think we're all familiar with is when the speaker asks the audience an outright question. Another way that you might catch on to a listener cue is a few phrases. Something might sound like, "This is really important," or "You're going to want to remember this," or they might be reiterating a phrase that they stated earlier in the speech. A good example of when you might get a listener cue is when our favorite musical artist comes to town and they say, "How's everybody doing tonight?" And then they say what a great crowd the audience is. Some other types of listener cues aren't necessarily verbal, but are instead nonverbal. An example of this might be a heavy gaze from the speaker, followed by some silence after they just say a main point. Another thing might be a big grin from the speaker. Something interesting about children is they need some prolonged listener cues in order to pick up on them. Next, I'll talk about the types of reactions listeners will have when listener cues are given by the person speaking. When a speaker asks a yes or no question, of course, there are times where people are going to verbally say yes or no, or they might shake or nod their head. Going back to our musical artist from previous, what happens when the artist asks the audience a question like that? Everybody cheers with excitement, right? So if a speaker talks about something sad or personal, you might observe listeners getting emotional or crying. Or if they're talking about something funny, you might see the listeners laughing. Other nonverbal things that show that the audience is picking up on cues and listening is they might sit forward on their seat. They'll maintain eye contact, have various facial expressions for what's being said. Or they might be clapping. So an interesting study that was actually done with social robots compared to humans teaching children with verbal and nonverbal listener cues showed that the children, after the subject matter was given to them by either the human or the social robot, they did comparatively well on the tests, whether the material was given by the human or the social robot. So it just kind of goes to show you that verbal and nonverbal cues can come from anywhere. So why do we use listener cues when speaking? And I think one of the biggest reasons is we want our audience to be engaged and we want their attention. There are different ways to get listener cues into your message when you're speaking, and one of the ways that you can do this is to heavily emphasize your words using volume or changing your tone or pitch. Some other things that you can do is ask a question, like I mentioned earlier. And I think it's safe to say that we've observed speakers do this in the past as we've watched speakers through our lives. You can add humor to some of your main points if you're doing a speech to kind of engage your listeners and give them cues. And actually, this is something that's done in British academic lectures. They do this in order to help build rapport, keep order in the class, and also relieve tension. So if you think about it, I think most of us can relate to school tension, and if we're having a little bit more of a lighter environment, it's a little easier to learn and not so full of pressure. Some nonverbal listening cues that you can use in speeches include leaning into your audience. You can lift your brows or nod when you're speaking. And an interesting thing about nonverbal listening cues is that they tend to have more impact on the judgment of emotional states than verbal cues do, just because they seem to be more authentic and true to the speaker's actual feelings. So now I'll talk about what you can find out when being the listener prompted by listening cues. There are certain pieces of information about the speaker that you can kind of hone in on, or maybe their subject matter when you're listening. An example of when something like this might be critical is in the case of law enforcement agents. Law enforcement agents do interviews all the time where they're listening to witnesses or suspects, and they have to be able to pick up on those listening cues so that they can ask good, unanticipated questions and maybe follow up with some evidence. And some of what they tend to do too when they're waiting on these listening cues is to be able to anticipate giving a good cognitive load to either the witness or suspect. An interesting finding with listener cues in the case of missing loved ones, people pleading for their missing loved ones on television, is that the ones who have shown to either be involved or have deception use terminology like they, somebody, or anybody. Whereas the people that are genuinely concerned about finding their loved ones who aren't being deceptive tend to use words like we. Another profession where listener cues can come in handy is in the medical profession. I think we can all relate. Sometimes it's not always easy to ask your provider questions when you're at the provider's office, but it's important for the provider to be able to pick up on listening cues and be able to kind of help you to ask those questions and get you the information that you need, as well as provide you good care based on the listening cues that you're giving to them. So in conclusion, now that we have talked about listener cues, you should have a better understanding of what they are, how to recognize them, and why they are used. This new information should help you going forward, whether you're the speaker giving a speech or a listener while someone else is speaking.